Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. For today's video, I am going to be doing a non-spoilery review for Out There by Kate Falk. This is a collection of 15 debut short stories that I would say fall into like the sci-fi genre, and I just finished this the other day and I really enjoyed it. And as somebody who is notoriously known to not enjoy short story collections, it really stood out to me that this is one that I actually liked. So I wanted to do a whole video about it and discuss it with you to see if maybe this is something that you guys might like as well. So without further ado, let's jump into the review. So like I said, this is a collection of 15 short stories that I would consider fall somewhere in the science fiction genre, but it's not like in your face like aliens, spaceships, that kind of thing. All of these stories take place on Earth, but like an Earth that is a little bit different to our own and a reality that is slightly skewed from our own. The best way that I could describe the stories in this book is that they are kind of out there, like as the title suggests. They're kind of weird, they're concepts I've never read about before. This is definitely not going to be for everybody, but it was just enough weirdness for it to be the perfect anthology for me. So there were a couple of stories in here that particularly stood out to me, so I wanted to tell you a little bit more of each of those stories that I really enjoyed to give you a little bit more of an idea of what you can expect from this book, and hopefully hearing a little bit more about each story might let you know if this is something that you might want to pick up or not. The first story in this anthology that really stood out to me is actually the first story in this book and is also the title story, called Out There. So in this story, we're following a woman who is in the dating scene. She's on the dating apps, but in this version of reality, women on dating apps have to be careful about these things called blots. So in real life, obviously, when you're on a dating app, sometimes you run across like fake people or bots or whatever, but in this book, when you actually meet somebody on a dating app, you might not be meeting a real human being, even though they look like one. You might actually be meeting a blot, which is just an extremely realistic AI, and essentially they're there to form these relationships with women to then end up like stealing their data and their identity and stuff like that. So when women go on dates, things that would normally be like red flags in relationships are actually more like green flags, that at least this is a real person and not a blot, because blots are perfect and wouldn't make these sorts of mistakes. So that's essentially what the first story is about, but it brings up some really interesting ideas once you get towards the end of the story that I just never really thought about before, and it really makes you think. Even though some of these stories are more like humorous kind of stories, they all have these underlying tones of things that you can really think about. Another story in here I really enjoyed that's more on the shorter side is called The Last Woman on Earth. This is only like about 5 or so pages long. Some of the stories in here are really short, like only 5 or 6 pages, and some of them are like 30 plus pages long, but this is one of the shorter ones, and it is exactly what it sounds like. It is about the last woman on Earth, and she actually has a like talk show similar to something like Oprah, where she interviews men, because those are the only other people in existence at this point, and it's just a really interesting thing to read about, like the idea of being the last woman on Earth. It's also kind of like an eerie concept as well. Another story in here I really enjoyed was called Heart Seeks Brain, and in this version of our reality, the aesthetics of your insides matters just as much, if not more, as the aesthetics on the outside. So for example, people compare like the size of their liver, or like what their veins look like, or the arteries in their hearts and stuff like that. And rather than guys being into like butts or boobs, it's like, is he a liver guy or a kidney guy? That's the kind of things that you find in this book, and I just thought that that concept was really interesting to think about, and like nothing I've ever read before. And the writing definitely adds to this as well, because obviously you can have like interesting concepts, but if they're not written well, it's just not going to do the same thing, and you would never be able to tell that this is a debut book, because the author's writing is just phenomenal and adds to the story immensely. So you have the super interesting concept that's also very well written, and it makes for a very interesting read. Probably my favorite story in this collection was called The Bone Ward, in which we're following a woman who is in this bone ward with a couple of other people that are all men, and she's the only woman there, and they're all there because they all have this rare disease where their bones melt at night. So they have to like go into these chambers where they can kind of float so that their bones semi stay in place when they melt and then like form back together in the morning. So we're following this woman, and she has formed a relationship with one of the men in this ward, and she kind of has this interesting dynamic with all of them being the only woman there. But that whole dynamic kind of gets a wrench thrown into it when another patient joins the ward who is another woman. And so we're following this woman as she deals with the fact that she's no longer the only woman there with all of these other male patients. And what I liked about this story, which is kind of similar in all the stories, I feel, is that it's almost like we're following these people's lives, and there's like a different storyline happening than what the like science fiction aspect of the story is. So like the plot of this short story is not the fact that they have this melting bone disease, it's the relationship dynamic between this woman and the other patients. It just so happens that there is this weird bone phenomenon thing going on, and that was just something I enjoyed kind of about all the stories, is that there was the science fiction aspect of it, but that wasn't like the main plot of the story. I will be honest, there were a couple of stories in here that fell a little bit flat to me, and I wasn't as into them as I was the other ones. One of those stories was called The House's Beating Heart, and I still wanted to mention this one because I found the concept of it to still be super interesting. I just don't think it was executed quite how I would like it to. So in this story, we're following a group of girls, I think they're like college students, and they're all living in this house, and one day they discover that there is a beating heart in the house, and then as they continue to kind of look through the house and open like the floorboards or these locked doors and things like that, they discover like other body parts that make up the house. Now this was one of the shorter stories in the collection, so there were some stories that were only like 5 pages long and some of them were like 30 pages long. This was one of the shorter stories, so I found the concept of this story and the way that it ended to be so interesting, but it to me was just way too rushed, and I wish it would have been more fleshed out, not even into like a whole book, but just like a longer short story. So yeah, overall I really enjoyed this collection, but there were definitely a couple stories I enjoyed more than others, or ones that I wanted just even more of because I found the concepts of them to be so intriguing. The final story in here that I wanted to tell you guys about is called The Turkey Rumble. So in this story, we're following a guy driving in the car with his boyfriend, and they're going to the boyfriend's family's like Thanksgiving, I think it is, and while they're driving there, the boyfriend is telling him about this tradition that his family has called the Turkey Rumble that is similar to a Secret Santa, in which you like pull somebody's name, but instead of giving that person a gift, you have to physically injure that person throughout the day. And yeah, that sums up what that story is about. So when I say that these are like very out there kind of stories, I really mean it. Like I said before, this is definitely not going to be the anthology for everyone, but if you enjoy kind of weirder stories, or if any of the ones I just described to you sort of pique your interest, then I would recommend picking this book up. Like I said, it's a debut, but it doesn't feel like it with how good the author's writing is, and I'm definitely going to be looking out for any books that this author publishes in the future. I really hope that she publishes some like full novel books, because I feel like any of these super bizarre, strange concepts in a full novel form, like to imagine what she could do with some of these ideas with like a 300+ page book seems absolutely fascinating. So I'm definitely going to keep my eye out for more from this author. What I will say about this book though is that it is definitely an adult book, so if you don't like a lot of like sexual themes or language or anything like that, then this might not be the book for you to pick up. But if you are okay with that kind of stuff and you want to read something a little bit weird, a little bit different, something you haven't read before, then I would totally recommend this book. I would also especially recommend it to people that are maybe going through like a reading slump, or similarly to me, you're kind of struggling to read, or maybe you don't have a whole lot of time to read lately and you can only read in little bits and pieces. I've been finding lately that I don't really enjoy reading books in like broken little pieces like here and there, because you can't really ever get into the story. So with a short story collection, I feel like that's the best time to read something like that, because at least even if you can only read a little bit at a time, at least you're consuming like a whole story in that time instead of like just bits and pieces of a bigger story. So yeah, that is my review of Out There by Kate Folk. Like I said, I really enjoyed it and I would definitely recommend it. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know if you've read this book and what you thought of it. I'd love to discuss it with you in the comments, or leave me a comment if you are interested in picking this book up now that you've watched this video. I hope that you enjoy it if you do decide to pick it up. And yeah, that brings us to the end of this video. If you did like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!